Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. My name is Pete Myers. I'm a senior public policy associate for the Connecticut Business and Industry Association, and I have the pleasure today of introducing today's speaker slash presenter, Alfredo Fernández from the law firm of Shipman and Goodwin. Alfredo is a partner in Shipman and Goodwin's Hartford-based office. He leads the firm's manufacturing industry team and international trade practice, in addition to being an environmental lawyer. Alfredo is an active member of CBIA, CBIA's board, affiliates board of directors, Concept, and is also active among CBIA's E2 council. He is one of the leading lawyers when it comes to PFAS regulation. And for those who attended our E2 conference this past summer, they had the pleasure of hearing Alfredo present about PFAS regulation moving forward. So CBIA has asked Alfredo today to come back and present to us and really drill down on upcoming regulatory practices. So I will go ahead and introduce Alfredo. And if anyone has any questions as it goes along, feel free to put them in the question and answer segment of the Zoom bar, and we'll go from there. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Pete. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to pull up my slides here. As Pete mentioned, PFAS is a pretty broad topic. We're going to spend most of our time today on one specific rule that's going to have a real broad reach to the manufacturing and international trade communities. Anybody who's imported anything in particular may be subject to this rule and just starting to realize that. So we're going to expand on this rule in particular, but this is one of those things that even for folks that had started to hear about PFAS or realized that it may affect their business, may not have had to take an active step with anything specific to PFAS. That's likely to change for a lot of the industrial community with this rule that likely requires some affirmative steps to comply with an EPA rule. So we thought it was a topic that made sense for CBIA's membership, and look, based on the attendee list, a couple even beyond Connecticut are joining us today. In terms of how our time today is going to go, presuming some folks have had at least a little bit of PFAS background and can spell it, PFAS, we'll linger just a little bit on background for the benefit of those who may just be learning how to spell PFAS today for the first time. A little bit of federal and state regulatory developments, but we're going to get right into the meat of our topic, which is this focus on the TSCA reporting rule. And then at the end, we'll share some best practices as to how to go about this, recommend the next steps, and kind of managing your PFAS risk for your specific company in a way that makes sense for your business as opposed to a one-size-fits-all. So jumping right into it, again, for those who don't really know what the PFAS acronym stands for, it's per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. That's a mouthful. I'm not a chemist, though I have a science background. So PFAS, it is. You may have heard the moniker Forever Chemicals. That's an unofficial nickname for these chemicals because they are very pervasive in the environment. They stay there forever, and we'll get into a little bit about how they get into the ecosystem and why they're a concern from a regulatory perspective. But they earned that nickname because the chemistry of how the PFAS are made is based on a very, very strong chemical bond between carbon and fluorine, and it's just very hard to break down in the natural environment and even with treatment. So what's all this fuss about PFAS? Maybe this is your 100th PFAS webinar. Maybe this is your first. It's a new category of contaminants, kind of a little bit different than traditional contaminants have been for years. They're everywhere. They're in all of us as humans, just from the food chain and from living on planet Earth. Sorry to break the news to you there. Oprah has handed out PFAS to everybody. And so have, your day-to-day consumer goods, industrial activity, the water you drink has put PFAS in your body. Probably at a level that isn't necessarily affecting you from a health perspective without without heavy increments of PFAS, but still, it is a kind of a known fact that just about everybody is carrying some level of PFAS burden after decades of using these chemicals and all types of commercial applications. So there are environmental impacts, of course, this from releases or landfills. The PFAS get into the soil, they get into water, both lakes and rivers and underground groundwater. They get into the air from industrial uses. They get into the raindrops. They disperse via air, via rain, even in undeveloped areas such as Mount Everest and undeveloped forests. They'll test for PFAS. You're going to find it there. That's just how pervasively covered the earth is with this stuff. And it affects, like we said, natural resources and then water as kind of the source for so many parts of our life, largely affected by PFAS. In terms of actual human health, they accumulate in the body, they accumulate up the food chain. If it's in a river, it gets into the fish tissue and other types of animals. It gets into feed and things the animals eat that we eat there, and grains, all that kind of stuff. And each species of plant or an animal absorbs it differently. Some are more affected than others, but needless to say, it gets into the food chain from the water primarily, and then as humans eat food, so do the PFAS get in there. And because of that, as research comes around, recognizing that this chemical we didn't really pay that much attention to for decades of use is now a health issue. The regulations, the government attention on PFAS as a broad category has spiked in recent years, and people are starting to pay attention. You may hear a couple varieties of PFAS. It's thousands and thousands of PFAS. PFOA and PFOS tend to be the most talked about. They tend to be the most used over the last several decades. These are things like Teflon and others, and I think I'll get to that slide in a bit. But going back to Jaws here, not just one or two or three little things. It's a body of 1,000, thousands. Including some lists that, based on how you define the fluorinated nature of these chemical compounds, can be in the 10 and 15,000 list of chemicals there. So kind of even defining what's considered a PFAS or not is quite the undertaking. Now, I mentioned I'll spend a moment on how these chemicals get into the ecosystem, into our environments, into our bodies, even our pets. Through decades of commercial uses and industrial applications, clothes and like waterproof jackets and stuff, as they go to the landfill or waste materials go to a landfill, oftentimes they'll leach out or get treated through a treatment plant and spread as biosolids. They'll disperse in the air. They'll get into farmland. They'll get into water. And then just different ways to creep into the food chain. And over time, they just kind of stay in that environment. As I mentioned, their chemical nature prevents them from breaking down very easily, like other traditional contaminants. Over time, will kind of dissociate, for lack of a better term there. That's not the case here. They just stay as they are for decades and decades and decades. Technologies are coming around in terms of breaking those bonds. There's a lot of money in how to treat PFAS in soil, how to treat PFAS in water, so that we can start breaking those chemical bonds with new innovative technologies. So TBD, and hopefully in 5, 10, 15 years, that's even a more developed area of science, where even though they are kind of forever chemicals, there's a fix for forever. I like to add a little humor into my presentations, because some of this stuff is not for everybody. So just to kind of kick us off on the right foot before we dive deep into PFAS regulation, which I'm sure has y'all very excited, I asked ChatGPT, a generative AI tool that most of us are starting to get familiar with if you're not already using it on the regular basis. And I will tell you, ChatGPT's humor setting, it's not that impressive, but I'm adding it in here anyway. I just asked ChatGPT, I'm giving a presentation tomorrow. Give me a joke about PFAS that'll kind of lighten the mood a few minutes in. And this is what they gave me. So enjoy it. It's corny. Knock, knock, who's there? PFAS and glitter, two things you'll never get rid of. So, it understands that it's a forever chemical, and once it gets out of that jar, it's out there forever. And as a parent of two young kids, if there's glitter on something, it will stay seemingly forever. Same with PFAS there. So thank you, ChatGPT, for your mediocre joke here. Where are we finding it? What kind of stuff has it? Here's a kind of a quick slide, not exhaustive at all, but things like waterproof clothing, non-stain, like stain-resistant materials, non-stick, waterproofing, grease-proofing, smudge-proofing, all those types of things are suspect PFAS-containing materials, brand names like Teflon, Gore-Tex, Scotch Guard, but various different consumer goods, various industrial settings, firefighting foam that I don't think I have a picture of it here, but a lot of foam, those like white foamy types of fire suppression materials, or sometimes we'll refer to that as AFFF or aqueous film forming foam, will be chock full of PFAS just based on the chemical formula there. So even things like Lululemon spandex have had tests to show there, and stain treated carpets, et cetera. So the way those chemicals work is that they make good coatings, they make good barriers between side A and side B. So they had a lot of commercial and industrial applications over the years. And then one important factor here is how low the levels are for PFAS in terms of regulation, and how low they are in terms of studies showing some potential health effects at just almost impossibly low levels. So scientists are measuring PFAS, and governments are now starting to regulate PFAS on a parts per trillion basis. Most traditional contaminants, asbestos and things like that, were in parts per million, parts per billion. But this is orders of magnitude smaller, parts per trillion. And just for context, that's one eyedropper's worth of a liquid in 20 Olympic size swimming pools. And we got a little joke from Caddyshack here in terms of everybody should be scared of the PFAS in the water, especially a baby Ruth size amount of PFAS in the water would be a regulatory problem, to say the least. And this slide itself could be a 3-hour presentation, and I think I've probably done a 3-hour presentation on it, but we have 2 or 3 minutes to spend on this slide just to kind of summarize where are the regulations going, what kind of industries are being affected, what type of products are being affected. And on the left column here, drinking water at the federal level now has very aggressive maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, that the public water supplies will have to be able to monitor and get below, or put in some kind of treatment technologies to get them below those very aggressive levels in the single digit parts per trillion. Soil and groundwater remediation, less so on the federal level, but states are setting PFAS target levels for cleanup, and it's kind of a mixed bag across the states, which is a theme we'll get into in a moment. Chemical reporting, largely at the federal level, but not exclusively. Various different types of federal chemical authorities and regs are requiring, increasingly so, more reporting on PFAS chemicals. How much do you have on your plant? And then, that portends to our main topic today, which we'll get to in just a couple slides here, is this PFAS reporting rule, which will be a big data grab from U.S. industry. We are seeing a lot of our industrial clients, as new wastewater permits come up for renewal, the state DEP is asking them to start sampling for PFAS. They're not necessarily setting a hard limit right now, but they are asking to collect that data so that the DEP can start understanding how much PFAS is going out via effluent or the exhaust water into rivers, et cetera, under appropriate permits, as a data collection step before any hard limits really start getting implemented into the permits. So that's affecting a number of our clients pretty significantly in terms of may not be happening now, but now I got to start collecting, and how are they going to cap this, and how am I going to deal with it later? And then food safety being one of the big ways of human consumption. So a lot of food packaging materials like those ironically the compostable salad and sandwich type containers are being prohibited by way of PFAS regulations. So that kind of segues us to what kind of markets are hitting actual prohibitions or bans or phase outs of PFAS, food packaging being one of them. There's somewhere around 13 states that have specific statutes at the state level that no intentionally added PFAS is allowed to be in food packaging in that state. It's not a federal thing. So there's a smattering of states across the country, but for anybody in the food sector that's selling food in more than one state, understanding what your packaging requirements are there is it's a big deal. Similarly, clothing and textiles as that stain proofing treatment, Scotchgard and the like, taking a bit of regulation as well. The firefighting foam, as we mentioned, AFFF, and then biosolids or sludge. These are kind of solid sludge from wastewater treatment plants that had been repurposed as cheap, if productive fertilizer. Turns out a lot of what gets taken out of the wastewater treatment plant in the sludge tend to be high PFAS loads. So Connecticut, among other states, have recently phased out PFAS. They're disallowed PFAS in biosolids that get spread on farm and agricultural lands. And Connecticut's ban on that just took effect last month. I forgot it brings me here so nicely. So Connecticut, just by way of our main audience today, passed a PFAS bill, now law, this past legislative session, and it builds on prior bans of AFFF and food packaging, and then this biosolids ban was the first to take effect just several weeks ago. Looking ahead to about a year from now and then beyond, other types of consumer items will not be allowed to be made and sold in Connecticut. And there's a bit of a phase out, couple years where you can warn and put appropriate labels on, and then by January 1st, 2028, it's a hard ban on those types of consumer items I have listed on kind of the bottom center area there. So one of the ideas was stop getting this stuff into landfills. All this stuff gets thrown away, then kind of gets smushed into the trash system, et cetera, and leaks into groundwater, all that. We could stop those types of consumer items. It's going to help. So that's underway in Connecticut. Other states have quite similar laws. Probably 10 to 20 other states have very comparable laws on the books. So that's, I'll take a sip here. Excuse me. I wanted to make sure we had enough PFAS 101 behind us so that when we get into the real topic of our webinar today, that background's just kind of there for you and hopefully has calibrated you to what we're talking about. So the majority of the rest of our time here is about a rule that has been promulgated by EPA under TSCA, which is short for the Toxic Substances Control Act. And that's the nation's primary chemical compliance, kind of chemical regulation law nationwide. Mostly it only traps chemical companies or folks in the chemical industry, manufacturing chemicals or importing actual chemicals, with some exception on the periphery. But for the most part, it was kind of a chemical industry focused rule or body of regulations. This rule broadly expands the types of companies that are going to get trapped by this reporting rule. And we'll get into some of those details anyway, or in a couple slides here. But in short here, all U.S. manufacturers of PFAS, which is probably not the majority of the folks on the call, but importers of items that have PFAS in it have to look at their 2011 to 2022 manufacturing and import activities and understand if they manufactured PFAS or imported something with PFAS in it. You got to tell EPA about it. And I'll get into the compliance report dates, et cetera. But that's broad. It is broad by design. It's going to capture a lot of small, medium, large manufacturers, folks that are just in the import business, and distributors, et cetera, that are not used to dealing with TSCA at all. Didn't even know TSCA existed until maybe today. So one of the challenges in dealing with our clientele is a lot of education about what TSCA is and the fact that this rule now captures you too, even though you've probably been okay ignoring TSCA for a little bit. That's changing here, and that's why the significance of that breadth and scope of this rule justified this this webinar today to get that information out. You don't have to necessarily, know everything under the sun about every import, period. The EPA's standard of care, so to speak, in terms of how deep you have to go, is what you know and what you can reasonably ascertain. If you know about it, you got to disclose it. If you can reasonably ascertain it from your supply chain and your internal people, you have to disclose it. If it would be unreasonable to ascertain the information, it's out of scope, right? But you want to justify how you've decided that it is unreasonably ascertainable, or just, you can't get that information. And we'll get into some of our best practices for those kind of scenarios. But you do have to ask. You have to start asking internally and externally to be able to say you got what is known and reasonably ascertainable. So let's talk timing. That's often one of the questions. How much time do we have here? This rule came out in 2023, actually, about a year ago, almost to the day. The kind of compliance due diligence period has been going on. EPA and others have kind of been in an education phase of, hey, this is a thing. But still, we're catching a lot of people for the first time here. And we're nearing the end of 2024. EPA recently bumped out the compliance date that was going to be in July 2025. Now they're just bumping out the start of reporting to July of 2025. And they gave about 8 months or so of extra time to comply, which was a relief for industry. This was all going to be due, I think I said July earlier, it was all going to be due May of 2025, which would have been real tight. But now we have better deadlines. January 11th of 2026 is going to capture the majority of folks, unless you qualify as a small importer of articles, meaning the only reason you're reporting is because you imported articles with PFAS in them, and you're under a certain amount of revenue dollars. And the number right now is escaping me, but it's it's not tiny, but it's not huge either. To be a small importer, which buys you an extra 6 months into 2026. Most of our clients that we're supporting are in the January 11th deadline, which is about 13 months away, give or take. That might seem like a lot of time, depending on the business arrangement, depending on how complex your business is, if it's multi-state, if it's multi-product line, if you have a foreign affiliate, if you've had mergers and acquisitions or divestitures, et cetera. It can get very complicated, and 13 months is not a lot of time. So we're dealing with some smaller one location shops where that timeline is comfortable, right? We have the whole year to get through what we need to go to. And then we have some larger clients with much more complicated corporate structures and history and environmental product impact, that those 13 months are probably not going to be enough unless it's all hands on deck for a while, and everybody's got other things to do rather than just become an expert in this rule in addition to their other job duties. So definitely a challenge for industry, and but we are working towards that date. Oh, and I don't know if Pete mentioned, I got a couple alerts here. We will handle kind of questions or comments or anything at the end. I'll get that list a little bit later. And we do have reserved time at the end to go through those. So feel free to drop stuff as questions come up as I'm going along here. Drop it in the Q&A, and we'll get to it at the end. Another question I get is, wait, is this me? Am I immune to this? Can I get out of this? Does this not apply to me? Chances are probably not. Like I said, most manufacturers are going to be snagged. Anybody who's imported anything is potentially snagged, but you have to figure out what you actually imported. And that includes most people reporting are not going to be folks with drums and containers of PFAS fluids, right, or polymers, et cetera. It is likely to be, or you are likely reporting because you imported something that was treated with PFAS, that contains PFAS, and that's going to be, unofficially, like 80 to 90% of the reports are going to be folks like that, kind of more regular companies that are not in the chemical industry that are aware or they reasonably ascertain that something they imported in the years 2011 to 2022 had PFAS on them. There is no size cutoff. Even a tiny company, to the extent they were performing those activities, will be required to report. This is a chart right from EPA. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but these slides will go out, and this will be kind of a resource for you later. A little bit of a flow chart here. If the main idea is, if you didn't import or manufacture any PFAS, then you're good. You don't have to report, and we'll get into the scenario where you want to document why you're not reporting, in case EPA comes a knocking and say, hey, we know you imported stuff. We know you're in the manufacturing space. How come we didn't get your PFAS TSCA report? You want to have something comfortably ready in your files that said, we looked at it, we did our due diligence, we kicked their proverbial tires, and we determined for A, B, and C reasons that we did not have to report because none of our activities met this definition, right? That leads you potentially to this red hexagon. The other paths that may happen, if you're only reporting because you imported an article with PFAS in it, there's a streamlined form. It's going to make the paperwork a heck of a lot easier. Still not a tiny lift, still significant, but probably about half as much of the information is required if you only imported articles that had the PFAS in there. So a little bit of relief there. There's also this R&D thing. If you only imported a little bit for R&D purposes, there's a little special form that's not going to apply to most people. But otherwise, if you imported the PFAS chemical itself, or it was a combination of chemicals and the articles, you have to use the standard form, which is pretty beefy, and it will affect a small subset of the reporting community, but it's significant lift in terms of filling out those papers, because it is a 12-year reporting window. It covers thousands of PFAS chemicals, and I don't have a specific slide on it, but this rule defines PFAS by a kind of a chemical formula definition. And as long as your chemistry meets that kind of generic formula that they have in the rule, it will count. And EPA has provided a list that's, I think, at least over 1,000, but they say it's not exclusive. And anyway, but for purposes of today, most PFAS are going to be subject to this rule. Maybe there's an argument that a particular chemical is not, but not particularly critical to get into the details of that today. Happy to chat offline for anybody interested. So I have to, sadly, step through one of the worst regulatory definitions I've ever come across in my practice here. The TSCA definition of article is just terrible. I mean, look at this thing, but we've got to step through it because it is very important to understand, am I importing an article? Is my thing an article? And, bear with me here. It's a manufactured item. It's formed to a specific shape or design during manufacture. It has a function dependent on its shape, and it's not intended to kind of chemically react during its use, right? I can't see your hands, but you can raise your hand if you're confused by what that actually means here. So a better way, I think, to define the concept of articles are examples that we have here. Clearly not an exhaustive list here, but just the kind of random examples that will give you a gist of what they are. It can be, furniture. It can be carpet, it can be engine parts, it can be propeller blades, it can be little packets, it can be boxes, it can be wrapping paper, things that are meant to, operate in the way they're designed to operate, but not necessarily release chemicals. But the shape of their existence, or their design is part of what makes them useful. And so, apologies for EPA's terrible drafting of the definition. But for the most part, if it's a thing you can touch that's not a loose liquid, a good chance it is an article. And part of the analysis, in dealing with this rule and the compliance with the rule is understanding, most of my physical imports are going to be articles for most folks on the call today. But there could be some stuff that's a little bit in the gray area as to whether it qualifies as an article. And there's a number of FAQs that EPA has provided that give a little more detail on different types of scenarios where it's not super clear if it's an article or not. I'll pause here for a moment as well to note that a lot of the TSCA rules before this rule would exempt articles, chemicals that are kind of built into articles would just be categorically out of scope for TSCA requirements and stuff. But for this rule, they're saying we want the articles, folks. So it is broadening stuff, and that exception for the articles that used to, or still continues to apply for other TSCA issues, won't be an exception that's available for this particular rule. I clipped a couple examples of import records that we're looking at from clients that shall not be named, just for an example of how you can catch this in the imports of this particular, or actually this is two different clients, particular companies' imports from 2011 to 2022. If you have stuff like this, and I'm going to tell you how we know this is the PFAS import. We got the word Teflon here, and this was a customs entry summary. A lot of it is gobbledygook here, but catching words like Teflon in the import, and presuming this whatever lighting fixture, PE pad, maybe it's polyethylene or whatever. We'll figure out what that actually is as we go through our, process here. But a good chance this would be flagged as a likely article that contained Teflon and would certainly be available, or not available, required to be incorporated into the report due January 2026 or July if you do qualify for the small importer. Similarly here, this was aluminum parts for a vehicle, and here my clue was PTFE. That is a polytetrafluoro. Actually, one of my windows is blocking it. Fluoroethene. But PTFE is kind of the generic term for Teflon. In either case, their Teflon PTFE qualify as PFAS, and this import of that thing would also be a recordable or reportable part of the overall report here. And there could be thousands or tens of thousands of entries like this. Understanding what's my scale by way of reporting is a big challenge, particularly for companies that do import a lot of PFAS treated or PFAS containing articles, which is going to be, I think, the majority of folks submitting these reports when it's all said and done. Want to take a moment here to, again, reemphasize some things that are not exempt that normally would find some kind of flexibility under regular TSCA stuff. This is kind of the irregular TSCA stuff. If PFAS is manufactured, formed, even as impurities or byproducts of a chemical process you're doing here in the United States, congratulations, you just manufactured PFAS, potentially on accident. But if your chemical process due diligence confirms you are forming a PFAS, even as an impurity or byproduct, that's something that would be subject to the reporting rule. And there is no threshold level that, I only did 10,000 X, Y, or Z, so it's not enough. It's de minimis. There is no de minimis. The de minimis threshold is 0 for purposes of manufacturing PFAS or importing PFAS. And then what surprises a lot of folks is they start thinking about this in terms of, I make X kind of product. And I start thinking about my bill of material, my raw materials and my components to make that product that I put out into the world. It doesn't have to be tied to your product, right? If you import something from your facility, for your facility, I should say, for a commercial purpose, you're outfitting your building. It could be lab equipment. It could be machining equipment. It could be repair, maintenance equipment. It could be fancy art from France that was treated with a non-stick or a non-smudge fancy frame. Probably be hard to might be unreasonable to figure out exactly if there's PFAS on the frame of an artwork, but conceptually it could be anything you import, even if it's not in your mind something that you did for the process to make and sell your product, including if there's foreign rugs, on fancier side of things, not necessarily like the standard rugs that would, go thousands and thousands of square feet in any kind of commercial office building that are probably domestic, but say, something a little fancier that may have been treated with Scotchgard or something like that. If that's known or reasonably ascertainable that it was, even something as kind of silly as that has nothing to do with the actual product and manufacturing and operations of your facility, in theory, would meet the definition here. That would be a recordable import. So kind of, like I said, pretty grainy, not a lot of wiggle room for a lot of US companies. I do have some good news, right? There are some things that EPA has made clear will not force you to submit a report. If you are just processing something with PFAS in it and it's not making a chemical reaction, kind of blendings on there later on the list, if it's not reacting, TSCA by how it defines mixtures and things like that, the details of which are not important for today, but just using them is not something that has to be in the report. If you distribute an article containing PFAS, but you didn't manufacture it and you didn't import it, not in scope. If you buy PFAS, whether it's the vat of PFAS or a PFAS containing component, if you buy it from a US seller, you didn't manufacture it, you didn't import it, not your problem, somebody else's problem. Whoever manufactured it or imported it, whoever introduced it into US commerce is the party that should be reporting that, but it's not, in that kind of scenario, wouldn't be yours. If you exclusively buy from your procurement supply chain from US entities, then you're in pretty good shape, right? If you don't have any imports and you didn't otherwise manufacture it, you might be one of those few, and we have a couple clients like that can confirm we didn't import any of this stuff. You run an import report, 0 imports. We're good to go. And manufacturing something from a PFAS substance or a PFAS containing substance, or using a machine that has a PFAS coated drill bit, these are not subject to this reporting rule. And there's a couple different types of products that are by definition not regulated by TSCA, so they're also not subject to this rule. Pesticides that are regulated under probably one of the grossest sounding statutes. It's called the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA. If it's regulated under FIFRA, it is by definition not regulated under TSCA. So those kind of pesticides would not be subject to this rule. And then similarly, if it's regulated under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which includes food additives, drugs, and cosmetics, not subject to this rule. But I do want to, before we move on, that does not mean those kind of food, drug, and cosmetic companies are automatically, even pesticide companies, even automatically out of this rule, right? If they are importing things, articles, that are not yet those types of products, food additives, drugs, cosmetics, such as, bulk packaging materials or, machinery, those types of things that do not qualify for the exception because those articles aren't what's covered under a different federal statute. Those types of imports will be subject to this rule as well. So we're advising a number of food companies and a number of medical device companies to find that distinction between these are your these are your medical devices, these are your food products, and here are your imports that either definitely don't meet that definition or are in a gray area where they might, right? It's say it's something, the actual device wrapped in a kind of a PFAS treated wrapper that comes kind of one unit, right? That's a little blurrier there. So I wanted, to provide some general good news here, a little bit of silver lining that some things are not going to be subject to this rule, but that does not mean you might not get trapped somewhere else. Okay. One of the important legal factors here in this case is how to deal with confidential business information, right? Because if you are submitting a report, you got to share a lot of stuff here. And we're not necessarily going to get into all the categories you have to report on. And article importers, as I mentioned, have a more streamlined form. However, you may, not want to share all your confidential business information. Thankfully, TSCA has a built-in CBI process that if something is truly confidential business information, there's a way to redact that information so that it's protected. And effectively, in an oversimplified way, is you would submit one with everything, all the information, and then one copy of a redacted one where you'd have little boxes blocking off where the confidential business information is, and you have to justify why it's CBI. EPA will get the CBI, but it just won't be subject to the Freedom of Information Act and other kind of document sharing that we'll get into a little bit about the risks of FOIA down the road. So one of the steps that we'll need to keep in mind as folks go through is appropriately using the CBI tool to keep your business information if it applies. Brief note here, because it's a little too technical now in November of 2024, but when it comes reporting time, all these reports have to go in through EPA's system called the Central Data Exchange, or CDX, as it's more commonly referred to. Those deadlines are real, they're hard, and unless the incoming administration provides further relief, they're on the books, and we're all working towards that. Not filing the report is something that could subject you to TSCA penalties that can be significant, and you don't want to go there. And then there is some record keeping retention requirements thereafter. Let me see, 5 years. Okay. So we're going to get a little bit into strategy now, right? I think we've done a little PFAS basics, overview of the rule. Now you recognize it's hard. How are we going to deal with this? Right? That's the goal for the next few slides here. This is going to take a lot of coordination between various departments that often don't talk to one another, right? Could be engineering, could be product stewardship, it could be your buyers, right? Your procurement team. And depending on how big your company is, maybe you have, well built out departments for each of those functions. Or if you're on the smaller side, maybe you got a couple people wearing multiple hats doing a lot of things, but it's going to have to bring together folks that have a different viewpoint of different business facts here. Right. You're going to likely have to do some external reach outs to your supply chain if you do have a foreign supplier. So you want to manage that carefully. This is going to be quite a drag on internal resources. So you're preparing for that, finding external resources that can assist is what we're seeing a lot of clients go towards, because this wasn't necessarily on anybody's job description 2 years ago. And then kind of understanding compliance before you submit, does this process actually unearth another violation that's kind of related but different, just in the process of looking for this stuff? And then how am I going to kind of maintain compliance by way of record keeping, making sure I keep all this stuff in compliance with the rule? One of the legal elements here we did want to touch on here as part of this conversation is PFAS litigation in general. We're not going to get into some of the big lawsuits out there with billion-dollar settlements coming out, but we expect a spike in litigation in 2026 sometime after all these, likely thousands, if not tens of thousands of reports go into EPA and become public documents. Plaintiffs' attorneys are already salivating at the treasure trove of data that will be available through the Freedom of Information Act, and we're going to request these records from EPA, and we'll have essentially a concession from companies that I imported or manufactured PFAS in these quantities over these 12 years, right? And imagine the what a plaintiff's attorney that's looking to make some noise can do with that kind of thing. We're advising all clients, maybe you don't get sued. We're going to do our best that you don't get sued. But if you do, right, your report's going to be Exhibit A. They're going to say you're telling EPA you had PFAS all over the place in your stuff. You never warned your buyers, particularly in consumer goods and foods, less so on industrial stuff. And we're going to sue you and give us all your emails about all this stuff and what you put in and what you didn't and whatever. So thinking about this report as you're creating documents for a future litigation, while scary, is a good kind of defensive way to go about the process. Like I said, too, the process of asking these questions, or maybe a supplier tells you something you never knew because you never asked, and now you have these various types of chemicals in your product, and you identify that, oh, maybe I should have been filing these kind of reports on an annual basis or whatever. You may be dealing with some noncompliance legal risks as well. There might be a chance, an opportunity for a voluntary self-disclosure in that scenario. Sometimes it's useful. Sometimes it might just make things worse. So it's a case-by-case evaluation. And then, if you have internal counsel, make sure they're involved and apprised, and external counsel's out there if you need it, given those legal risks here. All right. So this kind of before we head on our last leg here, I think this is a little bit of the summary of what should I be doing now? After this call, maybe I'll brief some team members, but what do we do? Right. We're recommending to our clients, and we're talking about this with multiple clients every week now that the education is trickling out there to the regulated community. First step is set up the team, understand what internal resources you have. As I mentioned, is it folks from different offices or different departments, and who's going to be the quarterback on the inside for the company. Identifying a technical consultant that's familiar with TSCA, with the CDX system, with PFAS, and what kind of products in a particular business are likely offenders, for lack of a better term, of having PFAS in them. And then, the counsel piece is important in our eyes in terms of taking advantage of the attorney-client privilege and then keeping a legal vantage point on this whole process, because as I mentioned, a lot of this will become public documentation, and you want to have the company in the best position possible from a downstream litigation or legal risk. Once that team is set up, you want to have a methodology established so that you can, show EPA down the road, we followed this methodology and we set it up and we followed it through. But the development of that methodology helps the team understand what do we need to do, and it's got to be custom to your particular business based on your suppliers, based on what your actual product might be or your imports may be. How are you going to reach out to folks, and what am I going to establish as reasonably ascertainable by way of asking my suppliers these questions or surveys or questionnaires? You're going to have to look at your imports 2011 to 2022. You're going to have to look at your operations 2011 to 2022, that in the unlikely chance something in your chemical operation actually resulted in the manufacture of PFAS, because the folks on today's call are not PFAS manufacturers. And you want to have a kind of coordinated approach to your reach outs to foreign suppliers. And then, as I mentioned, if you are reporting, which isn't a foregone conclusion, right? We've already determined a couple clients will not have to report, just given how they buy things exclusively from domestic buyers, which is great for them. But they're documenting all of that as to why we're not reporting there. But if you are reporting, you want to look at what information do I have to put into this form, and can I claim CBI, confidential business information, where appropriate to kind of protect company IP or trade secrets or trade information. And then kind of stepping back a little bit too, opening the scope, besides just this rule, right? This is a bit of a wake-up call for a lot of our clients on PFAS risk generally. And a lot of folks that kind of, I handle all environmental and sustainability and all, and quality and all types of things, wearing too many hats. Very overwhelmed by what this rule will require, but it has opened eyes as to, okay, PFAS risk for my company may be bigger than I thought. So our recommendation more broadly, besides this rule, is to, do your due diligence internally, go through a risk management planning process, understand how PFAS can come into your business, whether it's through your supply chain, whether it's through in a food type of scenario, what your what animals are eating, how irrigation water is affecting crops, et cetera. How could PFAS be entering my operation or my facility, or is it via my machines that have PFAS treated parts or whatever? And then understand, when I put a product out into the world, who's potentially at risk of exposure from an environmental perspective and from a human consumption perspective. And then when I'm dealing with waste, what kind of waste streams am I doing that might have a PFAS impact, whether it's air emissions, water discharges, waste drums, all that kind of stuff. Understanding how PFAS may come in, how PFAS may come out, very important from understanding PFAS risk, including even if you're on a site and you've never done PFAS at all, but the facility that was there before you was a heavy PFAS user or PFAS maker, chances are there's some stuff in that dirt and groundwater underneath your floor that may not necessarily be your fault, but under environmental law, if you're the owner, you are responsible as well. There's also some other liabilities in terms of PFAS for a business, right? If folks are being exposed to it at work as part of their job, there's a workers' compensation, OSHA type angles. Also in terms of how you handled PFAS, whether you knew about it or not. Anybody can sue anybody. It's America. And then product liability. We're seeing a lot of that with the makers of firefighting foam, food makers, but the scope of people getting sued for PFAS related stuff is aggressively increasing. So always a risk to keep an eye on as well. Want to understand, if a PFAS crisis falls on my desk, do I have a communications plan set up, or would I be starting from scratch? So a lot of times we'll kind of set up a holding statement where at least maybe you have a statement that's 75% of the way drafted and you customize it to the scenario, but not having to start from zero. And then evaluate, do I need to collect data? Do I need to, wipe my samples? Do I need to go test the groundwater? Do I want to test my drinking water? Do I have to test my drinking water? Those kind of things would be evaluated in the PFAS risk management plan. And as I note here on my last slide, it's not a do it once and put it on the shelf and let it collect dust or put it in some shared file archive that never gets opened. It's a living document. The laws are changing, the requirements are changing, business operations are changing, your formulations, your bill of materials may be changing. It's a living document, and it needs to kind of stay active as your business plugs along. And then just a quick consideration for attorney-client privilege. A lot of times for those risk management assessments, you could use a consultant without counsel, but that would be a way to create information that wouldn't be protected by the attorney-client privilege in a litigation scenario down the road. With the attorney-client privilege, the consultants engage through counsel. They help counsel with the provision of legal advice to the client. So a lot of the drafts, the impressions, the findings, the strategies have the benefit of the attorney-client privilege and wouldn't necessarily have to be shared during litigation, which we hope never happens, but people get sued every day. And then we often recommend oral briefings before anything gets put down in writing or put into an email file into the cloud. And for those in potentially subject to FOIA as public sectors, we support a lot of municipalities and things like that, right? Maybe subject to FOIA themselves, and anybody can ask for anything. The privilege helps there, and like I mentioned, we're seeing a lot of nonprofits and plaintiff's attorney already asking for stuff from entities that have to disclose. So that brings me to the end of my presentation here. I physically sit in Connecticut, but this is this TSCA thing is a federal rule, and we're supporting clients across the country, multi-state operations, and our brains, work across borders here. So happy to turn it over to Pete here while I take a sip of water, refresh my throat a little bit, and Pete can read off some Q&A, and I'm happy to think those through with you.
For sure. Thank you, Alfredo. And very good job, as I'm sure everyone can say. I know it's a heavy topic, but you did a very good job of giving us some background there and explaining really what's going on in this. We do have a couple of questions. I know we're short on time, so I will try to be quick. One question is, we are a multi-location, I'll just read them verbatim for you. We are a multi-location dry cleaner slash launderer. I'm sure we have serviced and continue to service garments containing PFAS. While we may not be subject to reporting now, is it possible that we may be subject in the future?
At the way the current PFAS rule is written for TSCA purposes, if you are not manufacturing the PFAS, and in a dry cleaning scenario, I don't imagine that, and you're not importing PFAS containing articles, which, if your customers are just bringing things to your shop or facility, would not be there. So for purposes of this rule, just your dry cleaning operation in the normal sense would not be something that would be subject to this rule, because it's neither a manufacturer or import. This is supposed to be a one-time data collection from industry, and I maybe should have mentioned this at the top. Supposed to inform EPA and the U.S. government's approach to PFAS regulation in the future for policy guidance based on the data. So it is a one-time thing. That said, who knows what the next one-time thing is, and something like treating or cleaning of PFAS-containing articles may find itself in the crosshairs. Sure.
Another question we have is, we are a machine shop, and sometimes machine parts out of plastic, i.e. PEEK, that may contain PFAS. However, per the definition of article, what we are machining from raw material becomes articles. Is this thinking correct?
Good question. I hadn't thought about, like a bar stock or something that if you import just a, whether it's metal or plastic or polymer or whatever, just kind of an unshaped, well, I mean, it's a shape, but a bar stock of material, whether that counts as an article, with the expectation it's going to be machined into some, more productive form. That's a good question, and I'm happy to connect offline if you like. I think my information will be in the slides. If you want to shoot me a note, I can think it through a little bit as to whether a bar stock type scenario is in and of itself an article, because it is kind of intended to maintain its shape and not release anything. Sure. So there could be an argument either way, but I just haven't looked at that question. But good question.
Sure, and I think we have time for one last question here. And for anyone else who didn't get to ask one, and didn't have the time to get to them, feel free to send us them, and we can connect you with Alfredo, I'm sure. If you are taking a raw material that contains PFAS and using that to manufacture, are you manufacturing PFAS?
Not if there's no chemical reaction in your process, but if you are, say, treating it or some kind of manufacturing operation results in byproducts, maybe oxidize, whatever. If there is some kind of chemical reaction to the treatment of something that contains PFAS, which may create another PFAS, and I think that's chemically correct, then that creation of a new PFAS would be the manufacturer of PFAS. But if there is no chemical reaction, if it's just, a CNC machine or whatever, and you take down your raw material without a chemical reaction, then no, that is not manufacturing PFAS.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. That was very informative. I know we got to a lot of questions, but I believe there probably are still a few more. So if you have a question or think of one later on, feel free to reach out to myself or Natasha, or I'm sure Alfredo directly. And thank you very much. And we look forward to hopefully having you present at our E2 conference again this year. I'm sure there'll be more PFAS updates by then.
Always.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you, everyone. Take care.